Thanks, Christina. If you don't mind, I'm going to just say a few personal things about what this means to me and how much this book has meant for me, and then I'll answer your question. The first is I'm very happy that the book is being released with one of my close friends, Shanti Singham, in the room. Her father, Archie Singham, A.W. Singham, was one of Rodney's teachers at UWI Mona in Jamaica. So it's really important for me personally to have Shanti here. The second personal thing I'd like to say, and by the way, you must read A.W. Singham's writings, particularly his book on Namibia, which was a very important defense of SWAPO, the Southwest African People's Organization. I think that's an era where America really needs to look again at its imperialism and understand how America was so much on behalf of the apartheid South Africans and the racist Namibian elite against groups like SWAPO. So I really encourage you to go and read Archie's book on Namibia. It's an instructive text. The second thing is that this is the 30th anniversary of Robin Kelly and my friendship. So we might, yes, indeed. Last month, actually. So we might actually look quite young.
But you were young.
We were young. Maybe you were also young.
I wasn't.
Lisa is in the room, and Lisa, Ruthie Gilmore, Vincent Harding, who had just written the foreword to How Europe Underdeveloped Africa for Harvard University Press. We were all at a very nice conference organized by our friends, as I said, Ruthie Gilmore, who turned 38 that weekend, actually, of the conference. I'm giving away her age. Sorry, Ruthie. And Sid Lamel. And it was a conference on Pan-Africanism in 1988. Now, you've got to understand the context. Rodney had been assassinated in 1980. But Thomas Sankara had been assassinated in 1987. And I think it's important for us to remember that, you know, it's one thing to recognize that a continent like Africa has struggled in its post-colonial period from, let's say, when independence began to come, firstly in the Gold Coast, Ghana, and then others. It's really important to understand how the Africans have struggled to create an independent path for Africa, and how imperialism has routinely and ruthlessly cut off the fruits of that struggle from Patrice Lumumba 1961 to Sankara 1987. And I have to say, and I want to say it very strongly, that we've forgotten how brutal imperialism was and is. And today, people have such a callous attitude towards imperialism. And I want to say this because I think you can't read Rodney. You really can't understand Walter Rodney unless you understand what it means to hate imperialism. If you have a very soft attitude, if you believe, for instance, that the American government, you know, has good people in it, if you believe, for instance, that, you know, people say this silly thing like there's a war in Syria, we should do something, by which they mean the Americans should bomb, or we should do something in Libya as if the Americans should bomb, and that this bombing is somehow prophylactic and is helping the Libyans and the Syrians and so and so. If you believe that, I strongly encourage you not to pick up a Rodney book because you're not prepared to read Rodney. You shouldn't read Rodney. In fact, you'll abuse Rodney by reading him. So I encourage you, if you think that imperialism is not a brutal system, I encourage you not to buy the book. I'm sorry, Ben and others at Verso, but I think this is important because it's one thing to have a posture of anti-imperialism and radicalism, and it's another thing to actually believe, as Rodney believed, that imperialism never let the continent develop an independent path. And the assassination of Sankara in 87 was really symbolic of the attempt to cut off an alternative, because Thomas Sankara, not an individual, but somebody who spoke for a movement, came to the United Nations and laid out one of the most sophisticated critiques of the international so-called trade system, which is really an international system of plunder and theft not trade. Trade is such a banal word, such a technical word. We talk about trade, development, economics. We should be talking about theft, plunder, the production of backwardness. Because backwardness was not a word that Rodney was afraid of. When you read how Europe underdeveloped Africa, you'll find lyrical passages where Rodney talks about how people were rendered illiterate. You see, what happened with the kind of culturalist turn is we became embarrassed about talking about backwardness. We wanted to say everybody's actually progress in the same place in time and history. That's not true. In Zambia, 60% of children who live above the copper cannot read. So don't patronize the children of Zambia by saying, Zambia is as developed as anywhere else. It's not. It's been theft. It's been a product of theft. Its copper has been stolen, not just by Chinese companies, but by Canadian companies and Swiss companies and American financiers. So what I'd like to say, sorry, I'm saying this before I get to Rodney, that to read Rodney, you have to prepare yourself.
Right.
Because to read Rodney, you have to be ready to encounter an anti-imperialist. Every author of this kind who I would suggest is actually quite a strong author, not somebody in the world of normal science, to borrow from Thomas Kuhn, but a paradigm breaker like Rodney. Rodney was a paradigm breaker. Rodney has to have you prepare before you read him. And the preparation requires a kind of political preparation. You need to put yourself into the shoes of those children in Zambia and understand what it means to live above copper, but not be able to read the contracts written by your government that basically gives the copper away to Canadian copper companies, whose government is run by a man who may be sexy and so on, but is nonetheless a part of the structure of imperialism. When Robin and Jesse and I were talking about this book, it's amazing because, you see, it's so interesting, and I'm so glad the subtitle is A View from the Third World. I'm so glad about that because the reflections, even from the left of the Russian Revolution, 100 years after that important, decisive event, the reflections from the left have been pathetic. People cannot understand what it means for peasants to overthrow autocracy. You don't want to spend even a minute celebrating this peasant rebellion against autocracy. You want immediately to start criticizing what happened in the Soviet Union. Because you want to be yourself pure of the complexities of what it means to produce a revolution. Rodney says in this book, revolutions are about transformation, and transformation is a process. It's not about moving from criminality to purity. When you move to the other side of history, when you open up a new epoch, you will still be stuck with your feet in clay, in all the contradictions of the past, and you're going to have to struggle. You're going to have to learn how to walk out of the clay. And I think that a lot of people, 100 years later, reflecting on the USSR, have been unable to see what it meant for peasants to make a revolution. For the leadership of the USSR to come from the children of cobblers, the children of small peasants, that was the leadership of the USSR. It's a little bit like the attitude today in Venezuela towards Nicolas Maduro, who the elite in Venezuela hate because he was a bus driver. How dare a bus driver cross the oligarchy? The kind of language they use about him, they call him a monkey and so on. That's how people referred to the leadership in the USSR, because these people came from the soil and they were bound to make mistakes. And do you know why they made mistakes? And this is the last thing I'll say, because it's really important to Rodney's stance, as it were, towards socialism and communism. You've got to remember that the early revolutions of the 20th century, whether it's Mexico or it's China in 1911, the first revolutions in Mexico, China, Iran, 1911, the Soviet Union in 1917, then China itself, 1918, how can I forget, in Mongolia, the second major socialist revolution. Then China, 1949, eventually Cuba, 59, Vietnam, 75. My friends, these are all in peasant societies. These are not in advanced industrial states. These are in places where Marx didn't anticipate the revolution to happen directly. He understood the capability of these places to move to revolution. Rodney is lecturing in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. He has himself written very important studies by the 1970s about agriculture in Africa. He understands that the African revolution is by and large a peasant revolution. It is not a revolution of the industrial proletariat. He's sympathetic to the fact that most revolutions have been, in one sense, even though they didn't use the term because they happened in 1911, some of them, they were Leninist revolutions because they believed that the agent of history was the working class and the peasantry. This Rodney is seized of. And this is another point that the metropolitan left and liberals and others who are reflecting back 100 years have failed to see. How remarkable it was that in far-flung regions of the Russian Empire, peasants rose up against the feudal landlords. This was not solely a movement in St. Petersburg. This was a movement in Kazakhstan. This was a movement in Uzbekistan. This was a movement where people with very little understanding of Marxism rose up against their feudal lords. And I think Rodney really understood this. And his theory, in a sense, of the Russian Revolution was in that way very much a Leninist theory. So I would say, friends, if you're going to get this book, because I'm telling you, it's one of the most emotional things for me to have this book published. You know, it's incredible, the incredible feeling. If you're going to read this book, do Rodney a favor. Read this book as an anti-imperialist. Don't read this book as a liberal. Thanks.